Hello, this is Neil W. McCabe. I'm the national political reporter for the Tennessee Star and the Star News Network, and a media fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategies. Thank you for joining us on Gold Institute Conversations and Insights. The need for the Gold Institute for International Strategy is now more than ever. There are few institutions in Washington that work hand in hand with global leaders to not only provide solutions, but more importantly, the strategic blueprint with which to implement those very policy prescriptions. Our global fellows located throughout the US, Europe, and the Middle East are the best practitioners, people who have spent their time in the trenches and who have reached the top of their respective fields. The current US Middle East policy is designated for destabilization. Afghanistan, the Iran deal, the absolute removal of forces from Afghanistan, the leftist Israel policy, hesitancy to support Egypt in negotiations regarding Ethiopia's Renaissance Dam project, and a vague Iraq policy, just to name a few examples of this destabilization plan. For this reason, we have assembled a stellar roster of fellows, including former members of Congress, the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, as well as a variety of experts in both the US and residing throughout affected areas to help guide our foreign and defense policy back on course. On the international stage, our fellows are also deeply involved in matters concerning human rights, energy, climate change, global anti-Semitism, the resurgence of the likes of the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS, as well as a host of other concerns. The impact of these matters on our Western allies and those who hold Western values dear are increasing. The role of the Gold Institute and our fellows play in navigating these waters is unmatched. The members of our team who are focused on these issues are former congressmen, parliamentarians, intelligence analysts, senior law enforcement officials, and practitioners from across the spectrum and the globe. Today's conversation on Gold Institute Insights is with John Wohlstetter, and we're talking about the 25th Amendment. And this is something that John has studied and written about. It was something that came up during the second Trump impeachment, but now with President Joseph R. Biden Jr. and the current machinations and events in Washington and around the globe, specifically Afghanistan, I thought it would be a great opportunity to sort of talk to John about the 25th Amendment and really how he's deconstructed it and sort of attempting to put it back together again. How are you, John?
I'm fine, Neil. Looking forward to our conversation. And the audience.
Well, John, you laid out 5 scenarios that could possibly play out with President Biden. But before we get to those scenarios, I thought that we could maybe talk about the history of the 25th Amendment. And you've broken it down in stages. And that first stage really takes us from George Washington to President Taft. So that's roughly 1789 to 1912. And they were in the midst of that. There were some issues, obviously, of presidential succession, but also vice presidential succession. So how would you describe that sort of first period of succession issues in our history?
Well, I had originally intended actually to break it down around Woodrow Wilson, but I decided to carry the historical antecedents all the way through the Eisenhower administration. And essentially, in that time, there were a number of things that appeared to be growing problems. The first is that there was no provision for filling a vice presidential vacancy. And in the first 185 years of the Republic, there was none. There was 180 years until 1967. There was none whatsoever. So you only with the adoption of the 25th Amendment was there a provision for vice presidential succession. The second thing was that during this time, they really had not defined the status of the president in event of partial disability. Was the president an acting president, or was the president still holding the office? And that's a very important distinction. An acting president assumes the powers and duties of the president, but does not hold the office. And this was first came about with the death of William Henry Harrison in 1841. He decided to give a 2.5-hour speech in the rain without an overcoat, and he died a month later of pneumonia. And John Tyler became acting president. He took the oath. He wanted the formality of taking the presidential oath, which was an important precedent. But in all of the 8 times that there was a vacancy, 4 by assassination of presidents and 4 by other leaving of office, you had not until 1967 a way to fully deal with this, particularly at that times there weren't even a speaker and president pro tem of the Senate, speaker of the House in place. So you had some periods in there where for months and you had nothing, and there was no cabinet succession. And the original, in the second Congress, the first time they got to it, because there was just too much to do in 1787, they put the Speaker of the House behind the President pro tem of the Senate, because the Senate represented a state. Senators represented a state, and it's much larger than just a single district. And that was the rule until 1886. What happened that really got things going, there were 2 things. One was the question of congressional participation in the succession. And there was no cabinet succession in that time. And what happened was that in 1868, Andrew Johnson was impeached, and within 1 vote of being convicted and removed from office. And it was a highly partisan impeachment. The radical Republicans wanted a vengeful Reconstruction versus the one that Lincoln wanted, which Andrew Johnson, as a war Democrat, was going to carry out. And so they actually, they were about to impeach him. One of the things that stopped it, one Republican switched sides and sacrificed his career for that. The other thing was that the President pro tem of the Senate, who was leading the impeachment, in the Senate, Ben Wade of Ohio, President of pro tem.
This would have been so John, this would have, the trial is in the Senate because the House had impeached.
That's right.
And the President pro tempore is basically leading the charge to convict in the Senate.
He is the next one in line to succession to the president. And in addition, one of the Democrats who voted against conviction was also, like Andrew Johnson, was from Tennessee. He was a war Democrat, and he was the son-in-law of Andrew Johnson. So there were conflicts there that were rather embarrassing. And then what happened was James Garfield was shot, and he died from his wounds there. For 80 days, they didn't know what to do.
Let's back up. Hold on. Let's not jump into that right away. So just to wrap up, so what happened with Johnson is that Johnson was a Democrat who ran on the ticket with Lincoln in 64.
1864.
Right?
Yeah.
Lincoln is killed. Johnson is president, but there is no replacement for a vice president, which remains vacant. And so you had this conflict where you literally had the man who would be president was leading for the impeachment and conviction of the president of the United States.
Yeah.
And so this this sort of didn't sit well with people, but nothing changed. And then we have a situation in 1881 with President James A. Garfield, who is shot but does not die right away, and he lingers for what did you say, was 80 days?
80 days. And one of the things here, which is very interesting, and this was another question of having any kind of involvement other than the administration, was that the vice president was Chester Arthur, who had been New York Port Commissioner. And there was a dispute over civil service reform that had split the Republican Party. And Garfield was one of those who wanted to keep, they were called the half-breeds for some reason, wanted to keep, to reform civil service and abolish patronage, but Arthur wanted to keep it. He opposed civil service reform. He was one of the so-called stalwarts. So Charles Guiteau shoots Garfield at Union Station, and he announces, the president is dead, and Arthur will be president, that he wanted to change the governance. Arthur did not do that. Even though he was of the opposite faction, he carried out Garfield's policy, right. But that was another thing. So in 1886, Grover Cleveland decided to fix this.
Hold on, but so basically you had Arthur of the corruption faction and Garfield as the anti-corruption faction. And but in essence, what you have is a 25th Amendment problem that still is not solved, because you have a president of the United States who is bedridden for 80 days, in and out of consciousness, certainly unable to function as president, and then he is replaced. And then once again, the vice president is not replaced. And so this thing moves forward. And I think sort of that next sort of hard stop for you would be Wilson, because Wilson and go ahead.
You know, the 1886 thing is important because by that law, succession law took both the speaker and the president pro tem out of the line of succession and substituted the heads of the executive departments, what we call the cabinet, in order that the departments were created. That was the first time they were put in that line. So that was very important. And then, as you point out, the next real milestone where we had a real crisis was with Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson.
And so changing the succession, John, what that did was that solved the problem of the conflict of interest, where you didn't have leaders in Congress trying to impeach a president that they were set to succeed. By putting the cabinet in front,
yes.
It basically said, okay, you can impeach and convict the guy, but you're not going to succeed him right away.
Not at all.
And now going to, right.
Yeah, Congress was taken completely out of the picture. It was just the cabinet.
Okay.
There was 7 at the time. Now we've got about 16 or so. But in any event.
Okay. So now we're going to go to Wilson. And because Wilson actually, in one of your scenarios with Biden, just a little tease that the Wilson scenario is going to play out. But go ahead. Tell us what happened with dear Wilson. And you know, John, there are 2 presidents with the first name Thomas. Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Woodrow Wilson. And so go ahead, please.
I had forgotten that about Wilson. Well, what's not known to many people about Wilson is he was actually born in Atlanta. He was a Southerner, and he was, among other things, a segregationist. So he really, but in any event, Woodrow Wilson in 1919 came back after the Versailles Treaty was negotiated after the end of the First World War. He comes back, and he now is trying to get it ratified. He has an uphill fight, and he also wants to get the United States to enter the League of Nations. He fails in both, but he tries in September of 1919. He goes on a long whistle stop, about a month-long railway tour, going all the way out to the west, stopping along the way, giving speeches sometimes more than one a day. Wilson at this point is 63 years old, and he hadn't been in great health. This came out much later, but actually he had had a stroke of some sorts in 1896, and if nobody knew about it. He was at that time he wasn't in the public eye. So he now is going around, and he's taken ill, and he's unable to continue. And initially, for a few days, that's what it was. Except that when they get back to Washington, he has a massive stroke on the 2nd of October. And the doctors know there is no way that he is going to be able to carry out the powers of his office. For several months, he did not even, he didn't see anybody. The cabinet meetings were run by Robert Lansing, the Secretary of State, who wound up, Wilson thought he was usurping him, and he fired him. He did not like that.
Right.
And so he's ill, and he's unable, even when he retains some of his movement, to make any major decisions. And for
just to so basically from October to the end of his term in March,
beginning of March,
he is in this state. He never recovers. And you mentioned Lansing. You also have Vice President Alfred Marshall, who every so often wanders by and says, "How's he feeling?" And but in effect, it becomes a regency with Edith Bowling Galt, the First Lady. So why don't you describe the regency? And yeah, please.
The regency was a triumvirate. Edith Bowling Galt, the president's second wife, the great love of his life, a very prominent socialite. And then there was the president's physician, and the other one was the president's personal secretary. And when Lansing approached them and said, do you really want to do this? They said, we are not going to even talk about it. And nobody wanted to buck Edith Bowling Galt. You got it her way, you got run over. The vice president, Wilson, had no thought of, as he thought he was a nothing burger. But the truth is that vice presidents had been nothing more than appendages up through this time. The first vice president that you could say was more than one was Theodore Roosevelt. But it really wasn't until modern times that when we got into, particularly with Harry Truman, that we got a vice president. Thank God, he was a great one. He became a great president. In any event, all the vice presidents did not want to look like usurpers. That has remained true through the present day. They're all petrified about even looking that way. We may have one now who may not be so petrified. But Wilson, literally, they ran the government. Any chance to sell the treaty or get in the League of Nations, although they were uphill battles, was lost. A lot of essential business was not done. But we were still in the pre-modern era. We think of Wilson as a modern president because of all those newsreels. But in fact, in those days, there were no radio stations with regular access. Less than half of America had a telephone. The first long-distance call, transcontinental, had just been made in 1915. It was very much closer to the 19th century than what we have today.
And so I think this is a good place for us to sort of take a break, John. You're watching Gold Institute Insights with Neil W. McCabe. I'm the media fellow here, and I'm talking to John Wohlstetter about the 25th Amendment, and we'll be back with our conversation right after this.
I think that the Gold Institute is filling a critical vacuum. There are very few institutes, I can't even think of them, that recognize the depth of the problem that we're in, that recognize America loses wars. America is confronting an ascendant China, a revengeful Russia, a theocratic Iran, a crazy North Korea, theologically inspired movements like radical Islam. But we have no strategy. There is no strategy for any of it. There's no strategy for supporting our democratic allies. And so this institute, our comparative advantage here, the institute's comparative advantage, is to do an autopsy of our national security bureaucracy. How did this happen? Why is this still happening? Even though the American people would be would be appalled to learn this. And how can we continue to send our young men and women off to fight in wars? And I teach at Georgetown University. I have many students who serve in the armed forces. They are sent abroad to fight wars in which we have no strategy. No one is asking that question. No one is seeking to understand that pathology of America's strategic blindness, except for the Gold Institute.
And welcome back. This is Neil McCabe. I'm the host of Gold Institute Insights, and we're talking to John Wohlstetter about the 25th Amendment. And of course, at this time is August 19th. We've just experienced the fall of Kabul, Afghanistan, and we have President Joseph R. Biden Jr. And there's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. about whether the president is up for the job. And that talk is not just coming from Republicans or opponents of the president, but it's also coming from sort of members of the military, the national security community, even staffers at the White House are sort of mumbling to themselves that maybe the president has lost his step. And so the 25th Amendment is relevant, and working on that before this current time was John Wohlstetter, and he published a series of 5 articles in the American Spectator about that. And we're sort of talking to him, we're deconstructing the 25th Amendment, and then we're going to sort of put it back together again with 5 scenarios that could play out regarding President Biden. But when we broke off at the last, before this break, we were talking about Wilson, and just to sort of bring us up to date, John, you were talking about how vice presidents were really not active, and you sort of pegged it with Truman. So I think it'd be fair to say that in the nuclear age, vice presidents have become more active in their administrations and more vital. But right before Truman became president, there was a fellow named Franklin Delano Roosevelt who had some health challenges, obviously suffering from polio. But why don't you sort of talk about how Franklin Delano Roosevelt's health played into the thinking that developed the 25th Amendment, but also what was happening to Roosevelt. Certainly, you were writing that by early 1944, the doctors had pretty much determined that he was a dying man. But why don't you take it from there?
That is correct. And they did not want him to run. Roosevelt was determined to run. And considering the other people that were possible candidates, it was in a way understandable. Harry Truman was not among them. No one was thinking of Harry Truman, who was then a senator and had made a name for himself investigating Pentagon corruption during the Second World War. He still wasn't. He was a Missouri haberdasher who had become a politician, and he was not thought of that way. But Roosevelt did pick him as vice president in preference to some of the others who he thought were just not up to it, and he took a chance on Truman. Well, Roosevelt goes to the Yalta Conference, which is one of the conferences, summits between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. that really helped settle arrangements, and not for the better of the United States in this case, for post-war arrangements. Roosevelt, a dying man, took a very strenuous trip going about well over 5,000 miles each way, multiple stops, and a week-long arduous summit. And he came back from that exhausted, and it was he just a little over a month later, or a month and a half later, in the middle of April, before his 100th days were up, he collapses of a massive cerebral hemorrhage and he dies. And Harry Truman.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me. So there's some interesting things that you're sort of glossing over. Number one, of course, is that we were talking before about vice presidents, and Democratic Party leaders recognized that FDR might not be long for this world. And certainly the Democratic leaders did not want President Henry Wallace. Would you agree with that?
Well, definitely. And Roosevelt was going to get elected if he didn't collapse on the campaign trail. He was going to be reelected until he no longer wanted to run. And of course, what emerged from that, besides presidential succession, was the 22nd Amendment in 1950 with a 2-term limit. But in any event, it was very important to the Democrats that they capture the White House again. And
right.
Thomas Dewey was the candidate on the other side, as he was also in 1948. And the governor of New York and former prosecutor. In any event, and he would have had to come in, and you're coming in late in the stages of a war, no matter how capable he might have been, it takes a while to find your way around the presidency.
So you have two things, and the second thing that you mentioned, John, is not only was Henry Wallace a socialist and someone that the Democratic leadership did not want to be president of the United States, but you were talking about that trip to Yalta, which basically, I think what you're saying is what killed him because of the exhaustive travel. But it was also at Yalta that a dying FDR basically gave away Eastern Europe. He was not up to Yalta mentally or physically, and it had long-term ramifications for the United States. We're still dealing in the world that was created at Yalta, and our president was a dying man who was taken advantage of by Stalin.
That is correct, but we should say Yalta accelerated his date of death by some indeterminate amount, but he didn't figure to live that long, even if he hadn't gone to Yalta. Maybe he would have lasted another 3 months, 6 months, a year, who knows? But it's very unlikely that he would have lasted the term. And of course, with the challenges at the end of the war, it called for a president who really had the vigor to be president. Harry Truman had that, but he had not been prepped. So he is told, he's right in Washington. In 1945, communications are still not, we don't have nationwide TV or all this other stuff. And he is told this by congressional leaders: you are now the president, be sworn in as president. And he is told about the secret of the atom bomb and the Manhattan Project, about which he had been told nothing. And so he's thrown into this thing. And Winston Churchill, the great wartime prime minister who later returned in the Eisenhower year, during the Eisenhower years, for another stint as prime minister in Britain, Winston Churchill said at the time that he was absolutely, he thought this was a disaster. And he knew nothing about Truman. And he said to Truman later on, "You saved Western civilization." So Truman stepped up to the plate. But one of the first things he did, he looked and said, we need to bring Congress back into the line of succession. And he, this time, reversed the order, put the speaker first, because he said the speaker was elected by all the members of the House. And he rejected arguments that said, listen, he was elected by his constituents in one district, and he wasn't chosen speaker because he could be a president. he was chosen Speaker to run the House. And this made no sense to a lot of people. And also the point was made that voters elected administration for 4 years. You get a midterm exam with the congressional off-year elections, but they want to be governed that way. At the time, though, and this was very interesting, the Speaker of the House, Republican in the 1946 Congress, was Joe Martin, very highly regarded, and highly regarded Arthur Vandenberg was the president pro tem in the Senate, and they had crossed the line with significant bipartisan cooperation. 1947 was one of the great years of what Truman in 1948, running against the Republicans, called the Do Nothing Congress. They passed the National Security Act, setting up the Department of Defense, the National Security Council. They funded the Marshall Plan, which saved Western Europe from Soviet domination. They passed domestically the Taft-Hartley Act governing labor disputes. So a lot of major things were done. And you had these two people who were substantial figures. But if you look at the cast, let's say, from the Kennedy years to the present, there were a lot of speakers nobody would believe would be a president, even the speakers themselves. And there were, with the presidents pro tem, though they were on average more substantial, many of them were elderly. Strom Thurmond was 100 years old, Republican Strom Thurmond, and Democrat Robert Byrd, 92. So and now you've got a situation where you have Pelosi as Speaker. The number of Republicans, except for the Never Trump faction, who would accept her as Speaker would fit in a phone booth. So it's a very—
All right, hold on. Don't jump. All right. Don't jump ahead. We still you've done this exhaustive study, and I want to be fair to it. Let's not jump ahead to the present day. Let me just say this. All right, let's take a break here, John. And you guys are watching the Gold Institute Insights with me, Neil W. McCabe. I'm a media fellow here at the Gold Institute. We're talking to John Wohlstetter about the 25th Amendment, and we'll be right back after this break.
I'm Martin Johnson with the Gold Institute for International Strategy. I've been in law enforcement for 36 years, 25 years of doing it, and 11 years of teaching it. I look for details and solutions. I always did. The Gold Institute does the same thing, paying particular attention to national security issues. Perspectives from domestic and international sources are always considered. They're always intertwined, no matter what the topic. The Institute uses research and active study as tools to define issues, look for solutions, find the pathways, establish goals, and get the ball rolling. You can write all the papers in the world and do all the research in the world, but if you don't get the ball rolling, how much good have you done? The Institute has solid leadership, has an awful lot of very smart people whom I've had the privilege to meet. I've learned a lot. You can learn a lot too. There's an awful lot of good work being done. Please feel free to check out the website, look at the mission statement, follow them up. It's worth it. It really is. I'm very happy to be part of it, and I look forward to continuing my relationship with the Gold Institute for International Strategy.
Hey, welcome back. This is Neil W. McCabe, the host of Gold Institute Insights, and we're talking to one of the fellows, the senior fellows here at the Gold Institute here in Washington, John Wohlstetter. And John has done an extensive study on the 25th Amendment and sort of the history of not only the 25th Amendment, but presidential succession, the issues surrounding presidential succession, and how that the interplay between the cabinet, the leaders of Congress, and of course the White House staff, and even we talked about a first lady or two. And so, John, we just sort of broke into the nuclear age, and I do want to get to those 5 scenarios that you think will play out with President Joseph R. Biden Jr. But we should probably touch on 2 other presidents and the succession issues. That'd be Eisenhower and Kennedy. And I think what we've been building up to is that throughout our history, we have had these problems, and it's been addressed sort of at the edges. The 25th Amendment really took hold of the problem and attempted to make sort of a very big solution. I think that, when we were talking about the vice presidents becoming more active in the nuclear age, certainly I would consider Yalta being one of those issues where you had an ailing president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he basically gave away the store. He was not up to his game and gave away Eastern Europe and agreed to basically what Stalin wanted to do. And I think people, when they realized that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was this sick, I think that, obviously that his illness was kept from people, or at least the extent of it. And people were saying, how did this happen that this guy was so sick and he was allowed to even be in the room with Stalin? And so coming out of that, we sort of lucked out with Harry S. Truman, who, whatever you might say about his policies or him personally, certainly he has fans and he has detractors, but no one argues that he wasn't a competent president who was up to the job and was able to run the country from the White House, despite the disadvantages that he had becoming president, basically being kept in the dark. But that brings us to Eisenhower, his heart attacks and his strokes, and then his vice president, Richard Nixon. So why don't you just sort of flesh out how these issues came to play during the Eisenhower years, which everyone sort of remembers as very stable and prosperous, but it could have gone the wrong way. And so go ahead, sir.
Well, it was actually a great decade for the United States in many ways. Yes, there were problems, there always have been. Eisenhower had 3 instances where he was partly disabled. He had a heart attack, and then he had a minor surgical procedure. Finally, in 1958, in 1956, I'm sorry, there came a moment which scared everybody and started to build support for getting an amendment done, getting something done, because Eisenhower was struck with, he had a mini stroke, and he was unable to speak for several days. And Sherman Adams, his chief of staff, called Vice President Richard Nixon and said, "You may be taking the oath of president for president in 24 hours." Eisenhower recovered, but he had at the time, he said, he had signed what he got his speech back. He still had a few more days before he was back at the office. He said, "Listen, if I am unable to do the job, I'm going to resign, and I'm not going." I'm paraphrasing, and that's all there is to it. So this engendered. They started to look at, but couldn't get anything done at the time, an amendment, because they just couldn't get enough agreement. But 2 international crises had actually been on the stage at that time, which were both concluded just days before Eisenhower's mini stroke. And one of them was the Suez Canal crisis, and the other was Hungarian revolt. And both of those were major crises. So Kennedy is sworn in 1960.
Right.
And now we've got a young and vigorous president. And so things are looking very good. And momentum for pushing an amendment sagged until the 22nd of November, 1963, that horrible day that all of us, I remember when I was 16. I never want to live through another day like that. Again, I pray for every president every day. In any event, he was assassinated, and Johnson resolved, listen, we've got to get something done. And as a result of that, the effort began in earnest after Johnson's re-election as president in his own right. And in 1965, in a matter of about 6 months, an amendment was passed by both, out of both houses, and it was then sent out. A majority of both houses approved, and it was sent out overwhelmingly, I sent out for ratification, which occurred in February 1967. One of the faster, nowhere near the fastest, but pretty fast ratification process. And what the
because there was consensus, right? Because certainly with the experience of what happened with Roosevelt and Eisenhower, there was already the idea in the ether that we needed to do something. And then the shock that a young, vigorous Kennedy would be cut down, everyone on both sides of the aisle, everyone just decided that this is something that had to be done. And I believe it also resolved the sort of vice president succession problem. So why don't you just explain what is it that the 25th Amendment says, and how does it work? What is the mechanisms for the 25th Amendment?
One more little threshold point. The point was made immediately after Kennedy's his death, that, and many people made this point, columnists, and it was seen in Congress and the executive branch, that what if he had not been killed? Suppose he had lingered but was unable to govern. There was no procedure then.
You quoted James Reston in the New York Times, writing that very point.
That's correct. And so they had to do something. And this was the moment, and Johnson realized these moments don't last. You get a few more years through, maybe nothing happens. And so they started in earnest. And what they got done was the maximum they could get consensus on. There were certain things they knew needed to be fixed. They couldn't get the congressional succession, the Speaker and President Pro Tem out of there. They wanted to do a little more about the double vacancy problem, but they realized that if you can't get consensus, you better pass what you've got. And they got the maximum they could get. And what they did there was, you have 4 sections of the amendment. That's the fundamental architecture of it is this. The first one is that, and this already was the case, but they restated it, when the president is removed from office or unable to continue, it could be death, resignation, illness, a coma or something, or stroke, whatever, not able to return. At that point, the vice president becomes president. And while the president is disabled, the vice president is acting president anyway. And that's explicitly in statute. Then the second section solved the problem, part of the problem, not the double vacancy problem, but it solved the problem of a president getting a new vice president. And what that did was say the president shall nominate, and upon confirmation by a majority of each house, each has to vote separately, a vice president becomes then, the nominee becomes a vice president. The third section was voluntary disability. President says, I'm disabled. President goes away for a while, whatever it is, an illness. And if the president is able to come back, in the meantime, the vice president's acting president, and the president assumes the powers and duties of the office. He still holds the office, but he assumes the powers and duties again. And this has been used for things like people going for surgery for a day or two, they're under anesthesia or something, and it's now routine, but it wasn't initially. And then the fourth one attempted to address the most complicated of all, involuntary disability. And that is where the president says, I'm able to come back, and the cabinet and the vice president don't think so. And so the vice president and a majority of the cabinet must issue a finding of presidential inability to return. The vice president has, therefore, a de facto veto. It isn't written as such, but basically he has to separately support the effort along with the members of the cabinet. It is transmitted to the offices of the Speaker and of the President Pro Tem. And when it gets there, it starts a clock. And this is the very important clock because the maximum turns out to be 25 days. Once they determine this, they have to transmit it, and there is 4 days for them from the determination of instability to send it to the Congress for the cabinet and the vice president. They have to do that within 4 days. They might have to draft it up after they vote and get it over there. Now, the Congress, if not in session, must assemble within 48 hours, but the clocks are already ticking. The total period is 21 days. If they're in session, they have 21 days to talk about it. If they take 2 days to get back, they can't do that. Then this may change with Zoom these days, how they work these things. It's the state of things as they are now. And then that's it. Now, the thing is, the president can go back again and again and ask for, could paralyze the government. And that is something that they haven't fixed. Public pressure probably would prevent that from going on and on. But the spectacle of this would be on the world stage would be absolutely devastating. So
it would be the spectacle of a president. It would be the spectacle of a president saying, "I am well, I can do my job," and his vice president and the cabinet saying, "No, you're a sick man," and now the vice president is in charge.
Yeah,
and then basically that becomes a standoff.
Yeah, the 25th Amendment left a lot of that open because there was no way to cover all the various scenarios. They didn't like the idea of bringing in the Supreme Court justice or a special commission, let alone a bunch of doctors. They have politics too. No doubt if they have a medical inability alleged or a disability, the cabinet will surely call well-known doctors to come in and make a diagnosis of some sorts, and probably the Congress will if it gets there too. But they couldn't lay that out in advance, which Eisenhower wanted to have done actually, but they didn't do that. And I think wisely, it's just there are too many possible permutations.
All right. Well, John, we're going to take a break now. And when we come back, we're going to run through your 5 scenarios for how the 25th Amendment could play out with the presidency of Joseph R. Biden Jr. This is Neil W. McCabe, the host of Gold Institute Insights, and we'll be back right after this break.
I'm Matthew Brodsky, Senior Fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. One of the reasons I'm proud to be working amongst such a terrific team that Ellie Gold assembled is that they are unafraid to challenge the crystallized assumptions that exist in policy circles in Washington, D.C. That has been an important feature in recent times, especially in the Middle East, the region I focus on as a senior fellow. Unlike other think tanks, which tend to write reports just for the sake of writing them, the Gold Institute has a track record of doing the type of work that impacts U.S. policy and changes the way our friends and adversaries approach their own decisions. The Institute is also home to a roster of fellows with a wide-ranging focus in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. I believe their unique backgrounds and experiences will give us an added edge. These are just some of the reasons you can expect great things from the Gold Institute in the months and years ahead.
This is Neil W. McCabe, the host of Gold Institute Insights, and we're back with John Wohlstetter, and we're talking about the 25th Amendment. And previously, we've talked about the history of the 25th Amendment, really some of the issues that led to the idea that it was necessary. And finally, in 1967, it was enacted by Congress, and here we are. We're talking now, it's August 19th of 2021. We've just experienced the fall of Afghanistan, and there's a lot of talk in Washington, D.C. that maybe President Joseph R. Biden Jr. will not finish his term. Obviously, we wish him the best of health, and we don't want anything untoward towards him and his health or his family. But John, you have sort of diced out 5 possible scenarios that could happen with President Biden. And the first scenario is that Biden decides to take himself out.
Yes, this is under Section 3 of the amendment. He's taken ill. He realizes that he can't perform. It really goes a little bit toward the Eisenhower scenario in 1958. Only this time, Biden doesn't recover the way Eisenhower does. Of course, Biden's recovery from whatever, where he is now, where there are some issues that a lot of people have, we really don't know just what his condition is. He returned to where, if he doesn't return to where he is, which is actually the first scenario, then in the second scenario,
All right. So the second scenario is that he's too physically ill to continue, and you would compare this to Woodrow Wilson or James A. Garfield. Go ahead.
Garfield is the second. The first is Eisenhower, and Biden gets better, and he returned to where he is now. The second one is James Garfield, and again, these scenarios have different endings, but it's just to put a face on it and a little bit of concrete history. Here, he has better medical care than Garfield had. But at the same time, he's not able to return. He lives, but he takes himself out under Section 3. He declares himself. He retires. He resigns. Said, "I just can't continue." The third one is the Woodrow Wilson one. This is the one that most closely parallels what we could see here, and that is Biden.
This is where the first lady becomes regent, John.
That's right. This is what happens here is that Biden, in this scenario, and these are all scenarios, they're not predictions, but what is his health declines, particularly his mental acuity, but maybe also to some extent his physical acuity. And he is really no longer able to govern, but the family decides, listen, we're going to hang in here and finish the term, and then he's not going to run for a second term. And Jill would be the engine behind that, and those among the White House aides and others that she trusts. I don't know what her list is, but we those, except we could be pretty sure that Kamala is not a member of that. And so and they finish out the term somehow. That's the third scenario.
So scenario 4 is there was a book about a Camp David coup, and so this is sort of your Camp David family generated takeout of the president. Go ahead, please.
This is a forced resignation scenario where the president wants to get back. He said, "I'm not disabled," and the Congress and the vice president, a majority, want him to leave. And this was laid out. The Night at Camp David was a 1968 political thriller by the great Fletcher Neville, who was best known for co-authoring 7 Days in May, which was a huge hit as a picture and as a book a few years earlier. And in this scenario, what you have is a president who starts to show signs that lay people would call paranoid delusions, and delusions of grandeur and of delusions of persecution. Doctors are a little more nuanced, and they're not really totally on board. The cabinet is split, and the president finds out about it, and he now confronts them in a Georgetown townhouse, and he gives a bravura performance, and some of those who want to push him out change their mind. Well, the next day, the president has more heart tremors on top of a murmur, more heart problems, and he declares himself disabled, and he resigns, and the sitting vice president then becomes the president. So disaster is averted in the novel by this. But it goes through the kinds of things that can happen where you have a dispute over how sick is he, or where the person who accuses the president is accused of being maybe ill himself, as happened in the book. You're the one who's sick. You have delusions about the president. And all sorts of stuff like this can happen. It's a Pandora's box. No one wants to see it opened. But this is one scenario, and it was very well framed by the novelist.
So scenario 5 is the one that I think everybody is licking their chops over. This is, I think you called it the palace coup scenario. And why don't you flesh that out for us, please, John?
Successor regicide. I mean, what we have now is palace intrigues. We don't know which factions are up or down, and people are leaking things to the press from one of the other factions. But it could be called a palace coup as well. Basically, what happens here is Kamala wants to be president. She knows that if she runs in 2024, having been a vice president, she's so unpopular she doesn't think she can be elected. So she finds some people, not only in the White House, but elsewhere, who have serious doubts. You know, Biden's condition maybe deteriorates somewhat more. She can't do it now. And then what they try to do is they try to get her out. If she gets some allies in Congress, and the Republicans look, the Democrats look at this and say, if Joe Biden is still on president in 2022, we're going to get creamed in the elections. This is where Afghanistan could play in, which was just after what I published. Namely, if his poll numbers tank and they stay down there, and the Democratic Party's poll numbers tank because of this, and they look like we're going to get swamped next week, they will have an incentive to push him out. And basically, there's either the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is they go to Joe Biden and whoever else is going to be in on this, and they say, go ask the president to resign. And if you don't do that, we can do, we will impeach and remove him from office. And because of Pelosi's snap impeachment, which was in a day, they can do this, and the trial was 5 days. They can do this really quickly. Right. Impeachments used to take much more time. And so she's created a precedent that it could be used quicker than anyone thought. And if
but the 25th, but to wrap up, John, the 25th Amendment is in fact a vice president and cabinet-led impeachment and conviction.
Well, not necessarily. You could have people in Congress. It's a group thing. But the main thing about it is that in real life, to get you want to get them out if you can get them to resign. And the way you do that is you tell Jill and others, say, listen, he can pardon you for federal crimes, he can. But you go through impeachment, we will have state prosecutors after you, and there's all sorts of stuff, Hunter's laptop and all that sort of thing. We could find some violations there and make your life miserable. Why don't you go out the easy way? If that doesn't work, then the other one is to declare a disability. And if they can get enough votes on that, if Biden's condition deteriorates to the point where he really isn't compos mentis at all, rather than just having some level of impairment, if it comes to that, then they could do that, or else they could persuade him to resign based under that threat. That's your two routes.
Wow. Well, John, I think that you have given the viewers an absolutely comprehensive understanding of the 25th Amendment, its history, and sort of the forces at play that forced Congress to come up with some kind of solution, as flawed as it may be. And I think you've also laid out that it is with us today, and it could actually play out in Washington today in this current administration of President Joseph R. Biden Jr. I want to thank you for being the guest. Go ahead.
One final point. We
Sure.
are very different nation in the America of 1967 or even in the 70s. There were partisan divisions, but we had common ground. Now we are a badly fractured America, and the impact of a dispute like this could drive us toward even secession and possible civil war. It is that serious a crisis.
Well, that wasn't the optimistic note I wanted to end on, John, but thank you for that. I want to thank John Wohlstetter for being my guest on Gold Institute Insights. My name is Neil W. McCabe. I'm a media fellow here at the Gold Institute and the national political correspondent for the Tennessee Star and the Star News Network. Thank you for joining us today. Take care, and we'll see you next time on Gold Institute Insights.